This is the 106th anniversary of the sinking of RMS Lusitania on 7th May 1915. The talk tonight is going to be not so much about the ship in terms of its structure, but some of the people who were on the ship who lost their lives, and indeed one person who was on the ship who survived. I'm going to finish off with that story. But I want to give a wee bit of background about the ship itself, because it was, in and of itself, it was a fairly unique ship. One account I've seen is that Cunard Line were given money by the British government to build both Lusitania and Mauretania on the understanding that they be built in such a way that they could be converted for war service. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but certainly Mauretania was used as a hospital ship during the Great War, so it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. RMS Lusitania was designed for the Cunard Line by Leonard Pescott, and it was constructed at Clydebank by John Brown and Company. John Brown and Company would later come into the ownership, or had an association with Harland and Wolff of Belfast. She was 787 feet long, and her beam was 87 feet 6 inches, and her depth was just over 60 feet. She consumed 840 tons of coal per day and had a service speed of 25 knots and a maximum speed of 26.35 knots. When designed, she had 10 decks and had accommodation for 2,298 passengers, 827 crew, and had 16 standard lifeboats. That's when she was designed, but by 1915, the accommodation had dropped for 2,165 passengers and 850 crew. So there was a trade-off between the space for passengers and the need for additional crew. But by this stage, she was also fitted with 22 standard lifeboats and 26 collapsible lifeboats. The massive increase in the number of lifeboats available is, I'm sure, a product, an outcome of the sinking of RMS Titanic. So whenever RMS Titanic sank and the number of fatalities, there were probably questions being asked about why so many of the big ocean liners had so few lifeboats. And so the number of lifeboats was upped for Lusitania. She was launched on 7th June 1906, and her maiden voyage was in 1907, departing Liverpool on the 7th of September and arriving in New York 6 days later. There are some firsts associated with Lusitania that I want to bring to your attention if you do not already know about them. She was the first British vessel with 4 funnels. She was the first ship larger than 30,000 gross tons, and she was the first ship that had been built that was wider than SS Great Eastern, which was built in 1858. So basically in 50 years, the Great Eastern was the widest ship on the seas until Lusitania. And she was the first ship to cross the Atlantic in under 5 days. Between Lusitania and Mauretania, they held the blue ribbon for the speed of crossing at that time. Of course, whenever Harland and Wolff built Titanic, the emphasis was not so much on speed as on comfort and luxury. The accommodation, as I said, there was 2,165 passengers and 850 crew. The accommodation for passengers was split into 563 of first class, 464 second class, and 1,138 third class. And as I mentioned, her sister ship, RMS Mauretania, was requisitioned for war service, being converted for use as a hospital ship. A lot of the information and statistics and facts that I'll be presenting about the ship come from a website called the Lusitania Resource, and it's the history, passenger and crew biographies and Lusitania facts. And I've put the URL, the website address up there, rmslusitania.info. It's well worth having a look if you're interested in Lusitania, or indeed any of the disasters from from that period. When RMS Lusitania left New York on the 1st of May 1915, there was a total complement of 1,960 people, and this included 3 German stowaways who were found after she set sail. The stowaways were held under guard as they were deemed to be enemy agents. And within the passengers, there was also 3 distressed seamen who were being given passage home in 3rd class. Distressed seamen were basically men, merchant navy or mercantile marine men who had fallen on hard times. They didn't have a ship which they belonged to, and they were trying to get home. And I think there was an attitude within the large companies like Cunard Line and White Star Line that they would give men who couldn't afford to pay passage, they would give them free transport, which is an unusual thing in that sort of period where there was a lot of hard-nosed businessmen around. The complement consisted of 1,264 passengers, a crew of 693, and as I said, the 3 stowaways. I'm never sure whether to classify the stowaways as passengers or crew. RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by the German submarine U-20 on 7th May 1915 and sank in 18 minutes. One of the headlines refers to it, the giant liner going down in 8 minutes, but that's either a typo or they were deliberately misleading to make the disaster sound even worse than it was. The wreck lies 300 feet below the surface, 11 miles south of Old Head of Kinsale in County Cork. Now, when I'm talking about statistics, one has to bear in mind that there are contradictory sources of information on the internet. So what I'm doing is I'm using the information that I've got from the Lusitania Resource website because it appears to be quite factual. So in total, 1,197 people died during or as a result of the sinking. 788 passengers, 402 crew, and the 3 stowaways died on 7th May 1915. And a further 4 passengers died after being brought to shore. So presumably they died of exposure or of any injuries that they may have sustained getting off the ship. 65% of the fatalities were passengers, and 128 of the fatalities were citizens of the United States of America. And one of these was Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, who was once one of the richest men in the United States. The sinking of the Lusitania turned American opinion against Germany, although the United States would not declare war on Germany until April 1917. But it was certainly one of the key factors that led to the United States entering the Great War. The military authorities in Ireland and in the British Isles were quick to use the sinking of Lusitania to bolster recruitment. This poster was designed by John Shuley and Company of Dublin and issued by the Central Council for the Organisation of Recruiting in Ireland. And as you can see, it encouraged men to join an Irish regiment in order to avenge the Lusitania. Earlier in the war, the similar recruitment posters were urging men to join an Irish regiment to protect the weak, to protect the small countries. Belgium being defined as being a small country. Belgium also had quite a high Roman Catholic population, and so this was being used to bolster the recruitment into Irish regiments by saying you're helping Roman Catholics in Europe from the oppression by the Germans. It's a very striking poster because of the way it's depicted Lusitania, with one of the chimney stacks exploding and with people clinging to wreckage. Right in the foreground, you can see 2 people, or 1 person who's clinging to a spar. So it's quite an evocative poster, and I think it would have had a very high impact in terms of recruitment. You can even see there's a couple of the lifeboats still being lowered, even though the ship is already tilted and sinking at the front end. On 19th May 1915, the Belfast newsletter reported on a recruitment meeting that was held in Market Square in Dundalk. Before the meeting began, Mr. Samuel John Cox, General Manager of the Dundalk and Newry Steam Packet Company, put forward a motion that was seconded by Mr. Edward Goodman, a city councillor or county councillor. And the wording of the motion was, this meeting of the inhabitants of Dundalk and County Louth desired to place on record its abhorrence of the murder of the Lusitania victims and to tender to the relatives of the County Louth people who perished their severe condolences. One of the victims of the sinking of RMS Lusitania was a trimmer who was from Dundalk, and that's James Hoey. He was born on 15th May 1891 at Garbala near Duleek in County Meath to John Hoey and Rose Conlon. In 1901, he was living with his paternal grandparents, James and Rose Hoey, at Drumcastle near Ardee in County Louth. In 1911, James was a farm servant and was living with his aunt Teresa Murphy and his widowed mother, aged 73, at Dublin Street in Dundalk town. The caption to the newspaper photograph records that he was living with his grandmother and sister at Mary Street in Dundalk, and that the fatal voyage was his first on Lusitania as a member of the crew. He was 23 years old when he died, and Rose Hoey was registered as dying of senility at the Dundalk Union Workhouse on 16th November 1921, aged 80. So in preparing for this talk, I've been checking my newspaper archive of photographs from the Great War period of service personnel. And although James Hoey was a civilian employed by the Mercantile Marine and the Cunard Line, he still falls into my the archive that John McCormick and myself have, because the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, is regarded as the staff, the employees, are regarded as official war casualties. So some of the men I'll be talking about tonight will be men for whom I have newspaper photographs. So returning to the recruitment rally, one of the speakers was Lieutenant Thomas Michael Kettle, who said there was only one effective way to make their point against the German murderers, and that was at the point of a bayonet. He thought the need for recruits had not been sufficiently realised, and it was realised least of all by the farmers and farmers' sons in the Irish county districts. He went on to say that the struggle was between the principles of paganism, which was brute force, and the principle of Christianity, which was justice. In response to someone in the audience saying, "Remember 98," a reference to the United Irishman Rebellion of 1898, Lieutenant Kettle replied that the men of that time were in battle against their government, but the people they had been fighting against were not poisoners. So again, you can see how by this stage, a lot of vitriol was coming into the recruitment, where the Germans were being portrayed as evil, being portrayed as poisoners, poisoning water supplies and so forth, particularly water supplies for civilians. He went on to say that if Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet were alive today, they would not be on the side of the Germans. This war had united all political sections in Ireland. They had made their minds that if they were going to break one another's heads in Ireland after the war, they would join forces together and break the Kaiser's head first. Lieutenant Tom Kettle was deployed to France later on in 1915, in December 1915, with 9th Battalion Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which was part of the 16th Irish Division. He was killed in action in an attack on German lines near Ginchy on 9th September 1916 during the Somme offensive. And you can see at the side there, I've got the newspaper headlines and the formal complaint, or not complaint, motion that was passed by the meeting, that the meeting places on record its abhorrence of the murder of the Lusitania victims. So that's Tom Kettle, and it's also something about recruitment in County Louth and how the RMS Lusitania was used to to bolster the recruitment campaign in Ireland. So the first of the victims that I'm going to be talking about, civilian victims that is Walter Dawson George Patton Mitchell, who was born on 27th December 1887 at Seymour Street in Lisburn, to the Reverend George Patton Mitchell, who was rector of Drumbo Parish Church, and Elizabeth Dawson Poundon. In the register of births, his forenames were recorded as George Patton, but there's an amendment dated 6th of April 1888 in the birth register to include William Dawson as his forenames. So he has 4 forenames. Walter Mitchell was a mill manager at the Island Spinning Company in Lisburn when he was offered a job as the assistant manager of the Marshall Mills at Kearney in New Jersey. He proposed to his childhood sweetheart, Jeanette Elizabeth Mary Moore, and they were married on the 28th December 1912 at Drumbo Parish Church, the ceremony being conducted by Walter's father. Later the same day, they boarded SS California at Londonderry, bound for a new life in the United States. They arrived in New York on the 8th of January 1913, and they lived with a Mrs. Crozier at Broad Street in Newark, New Jersey. Their only son, also called Walter Dawson George Patton Mitchell, was born in Newark in August 1914. Walter, Jeanette, and their son decided to return to Ireland to visit relatives, and they travelled in second class along with Jeanette's brother John Moore, who was returning to Ireland to enlist for war service. According to some sources, Jeanette Mitchell was laid with the other fatalities until her brother saw her eyelids fluttering, at which point Jeanette was resuscitated. The Lisburn Standard, one of the local newspapers, reported that it was chiefly due to John's presence of mind that his sister did not share the same fate as her husband. Master Walter Dawson Mitchell, who was 10 months old, was recorded as body number 122 and was interred in Common Grave C at the Old Churchyard Cemetery in Queenstown, which is now Cove. Walter Dawson Mitchell Sr., who was 27 years old, was recorded as body number 56, and his remains were returned to his home at Drumbo Rectory for burial in the graveyard at Holy Trinity Church, Ballylesson. And that burial took place on the 11th of May 1915. Probate of Walter's estate was cleared in June 1915, and Jeanette Mitchell was beneficiary to the effects, which amounted to £640, 13 shillings and 4pence. In today's equivalent, that would be £74,350. So not a bad wee sum. This is the memorial headstone in the graveyard for the Mitchell family. And on it, in this panel here, there is a reference to Walter Dawson. Unusually, Walter Dawson Jr. is not recorded on the headstone. There is also a memorial tablet within Holy Trinity Church at Ballylesson, which records the deaths of both father and son. And I've just realised that Peter McCabe's talk is actually next Tuesday, so you've that to look forward to. He had the tour a couple of weeks ago, and he's giving an online talk about some of the other, this grave and some of the other graves at Ballylesson next Tuesday, again on the same channel, so make sure you tune in for that. Jeanette Mitchell subsequently married William Waters on 29th March 1922, and she died on 19th January 1966 at the age of 78. She was buried in the Moore family plot at Ballylesson Churchyard on 22nd January 1966. And the Moore headstone, Moore plot, is not very far away from the Mitchell plot. Also commemorated on the headstone is her brother, 2nd Lieutenant Archibald Moore, who was killed in action on 26th March 1918, aged 28, while serving with the Royal Irish Rifles. He has no known grave and is commemorated on the Pozières Memorial in France. And that's the headstone for the Moore family. It's difficult to photograph because of the nature of the stone surface. You can see that here it mentions John died in the USA on the 27th of May 1948 or 45. So he must have survived the Great War and returned to the United States. You have Archibald, 2nd Lieutenant Royal Irish Rifles, killed in action 26th March 1918. And down at the bottom, Jeanette, widow of W.D. Waters, died, and so forth. So it's strange that Jeanette is not buried with her husband, but is buried with the rest of her family. One of the factors about war fatalities and classification of war fatalities is that members of the mercantile marine in the First World War, merchant navy in the Second World War, if they died as a result of enemy action, in other words, torpedoing or some sort of bombing, then depending on the circumstances, they could be classified as war fatalities. But it was not just the men who were the seamen and the engineers and so forth. It was any member of staff, including Sadie Hale. Sarah Rachel Orr Hale, who was known as Sadie, was born on 17th December 1885 at Bridge Street in Ballymena to John Hale and Matilda Jane Hamill. John Hale, a grocer and gas company manager, died of pneumonia at Prochaine Street in Ballymena on the 3rd of February 1889 at the age of 61. In 1901, Matilda Jane Hale and her son John and daughter Sadie were living at North Parade in the Ormeau ward of Belfast. Sadie Ward was employed as a typist by the Cunard Line, and as she was part of the ship's complement, she qualifies as an official war fatality. So her details are recorded on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. Her body was returned to the family home for burial in Belfast City Cemetery on 12th May. In 1901, her brother, John Frederick Downshire Hale, was an apprentice electrical engineer, and he died in Liverpool on 7th November 1915, exactly 7 months after the death of his sister. Matilda Jane Hale was living at Ierney on Cranmore Gardens in the Windsor ward when she died of influenza and pneumonia at her home on 25th April 1919 at the age of 69. So having seen her daughter and her son predecease her by 4 years, Matilda succumbed to what was known as the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 1918-1919. Not far away from Sadie's grave is a family memorial for the Houston family, which commemorates a fatality of Lusitania. Francis Houston, and that's a newspaper photograph of Francis to the side of the screen, was born on 1st January 1888 at Silvio Street in the Shankill area, to Francis Houston, who was a linen loom engineer, and Ellen Maria Hamilton. In 1901, the family was living at Enfield Street in the Woodvale area, but had moved to Monkstown on the outskirts of Belfast by 1911. And at that stage, Francis Houston Sr. was a power loom engineer at one of the bleach works in and around White House. Francis and Ellen Houston were living at Fernbrook Cottage in Carnmoney when their son was killed. Frank Houston was a third-class passenger on RMS Lusitania, and there is no record of his body being recovered for burial. He was returning to Ireland to enlist for war service, and that's quite a common theme amongst people who died, men who died on RMS Lusitania, is that they were men from the United Kingdom, from Ireland, who had emigrated to Canada or the United States, and they were returning home to enlist for war service. Of course, a lot of the men in Canada would have enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but as at that stage, the United States had not made the decision to enter the war, many men who were from the British Isles were returning home to enlist. He's commemorated on the gravestone at his parents' plot in Belfast City Cemetery. So you can just see, where is it? Frank Houston, lost on SS Lusitania, 7th May 1915. It refers to it as SS steamship, but she was a Royal Mail ship. So the correct terminology would be RMS Lusitania, but the terms are sort of interchangeable to a certain extent. This is the Great War Memorial in Ballycairn Presbyterian Church at Ballylesson. And one of the names recorded at the bottom is McElroy Archibald. And this is Archibald McElroy, who is a JP and focused in. So you've got McElroy Archibald JP. The JP is not four names, but Justice of the Peace. Lost in the torpedoed Lusitania. So there were 7 fatalities from Ballycairn Presbyterian Church in the Great War. One of those was a civilian who was lost on the Lusitania. And it's unusual to see civilians recorded on war memorials. Quite often you would see civilians who were involved in organizations like the Red Cross or the YMCA who died being recorded, but it's unusual to see a civilian who died on the sinking of a ship or some other similar circumstance. Archibald McElroy was born around 1860 at Ballyclare to Ezekiel McElroy and Margaret Sarah McMurtry. He was educated at Belfast Mercantile College on Glenravel Street and then at the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. Although he wanted to train for the ministry, his father encouraged him to sit the banking entrance examination. Archibald was a bank clerk with the Ulster Bank when he married Anna Caroline Montgomery on 2nd September 1890 at Ballycairn Presbyterian Church. He was recorded as being a commission and insurance agent when James Montgomery McElroy, their child, was born on 28th May at Drumbow, although the family was recorded as living at Balmoral. In 1901 census, Archibald, Anna and James were living at Drumcairn on Derrimore Park, and Archibald was now recorded as being a coal merchant. In 1911, they were living at Drumbow, and Archibald was now recorded as being a stockbroker. So he started off as a bank clerk, and then 20 years later, he's being recorded as being a stockbroker. Archibald McElroy was also a published author in the Kailyard style, and this was a late 19th century movement in Scottish and Ulster Scots literature that was characterized by a sentimental idealization of humble village life. Archibald's novels in particular captured the ethos of rural life from a Presbyterian perspective. Among the novels were When the Lint Was in the Bell, The Earl Meeting Hoose Green, 1898, and The Banker's Love Story, 1901. And you can see that that's the cover of an edition of The Earl Meeting Hoose Green. See the way I'm fluent in Ulster Scots? Archibald and Anna McElroy emigrated to Canada, leaving from Liverpool and arriving at St. John in New Brunswick in early February 1912. They stated missionary as their intended occupation. Archibald was living at Edmonton in Alberta when he decided to return to Ireland, and they joined Lusitania as second-class passengers. Some accounts refer to him returning to volunteer for war service, but as he was 55 years old at the time, I think that's highly unlikely, unless he was returning to volunteer for war service in a non-combatant role, possibly as a pastor or with the YMCA. He was 55 years old, as I said, when he died, and there's no known grave. James Montgomery McElroy was living in Winnipeg when he married Olive Hope Dufton at Thunder Bay in Ontario on 2nd December 1920. Anna Caroline McElroy died in Toronto on 21st July 1942 at the age of 77. Two Belfast men living in Toronto decided to return to Ireland to enlist for war service. Thomas McAfee had turned down the opportunity to depart and sail on an earlier ship so that he and Robert could travel together. It was a decision which cost him his life. Thomas Hugh Thompson McAfee was born on 30th September 1886 on the Shankill Road to William McAfee, who was a linen lapper, and Mary Ann Thompson. In 1901 and 1911, Thomas and some of his siblings were living with two maternal aunts in Summer Street in the Clifton ward. In 1911, Thomas was an apprentice clerk in a wareroom, and he was a linen measurer at the York Street Flax and Spinning Company in 1911. Thomas was a draper when he emigrated to North America in 1913, departing from Liverpool aboard SS Teutonic on 15th March and arriving at Halifax, Nova Scotia on 23rd March. Thomas McAfee was travelling third class, and his pocketbook and letters and papers were found floating in the sea after the disaster. They were recovered, dried out, and forwarded to his sister living at Summer Street on the 30th of August 1915. Several months later, but I'm sure that his sister prized having some of his possessions back, something with which she could recall his life. Robert George Macready was born on 7th April 1886 at Ballynahoe Moor near Mackeraw in County Londonderry. His parents were William John Macready, who was a farmer, and Margaret Glover. By 1901, the family was living on the Old Park Road in Belfast, and William was recorded as being a goods clerk. In 1901, Robert, who was then aged 14, was recorded as being a photographer, being employed as a photographer. In 1911, the family was living at Alexandra Park Avenue in the Duncairn ward, and William, the father, was working as a commercial traveller. Robert Macready, or Robert George Macready, had worked as a photographer for Messrs. Charles and Russell Photographers of Royal Avenue for 12 years when he emigrated to North America. He sailed on board SS Canada, which departed Liverpool on 5th April 1913 and arrived at Halifax, Nova Scotia on 13th April. When Robert was in America, he undertook photographic tours in the United States and in Canada, and he met up with his friend Thomas McAfee, and they were living in Toronto when they decided to return home. Like Thomas, Robert Macready was traveling in third class, and no body was recovered or identified. He was 29 years old when he died, and he is recorded on the Roll of Honour for Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church in Belfast, a church which was destroyed in the German air raids of 1941. So again, we've got two civilian fatalities on RMS Lusitania, both commemorated on war memorials or war rolls of honour in Presbyterian churches in or near Belfast. This wonderful window, stained glass window in St. Donard's Church of Ireland in Bloomfield commemorates a Lusitania fatality, and that is Margaret Anderson, née Scott, whose picture is at the side, to one side. The window was made and installed by Warden Partners, one of Belfast's two main stained glass windows manufacturers alongside Clokey. The detail on it and the colours are truly fantastic. You can see in the foreground that you've got the soldiers who were guarding the tomb of Christ, who have fallen asleep. One of them in the centre is actually still holding a flagon. So the implication is that he was drinking on duty and fell asleep as a consequence. The soldiers that have woken up are gazing at the risen Christ figure with looks of awe and amazement on their faces. Truly is a wonderful window. And if you ever get a chance to pop into St. Donard's and have a look at it, please do so. In the top trefoils, you've got the Alpha and Omega symbols, and right at the top, you've got the dove of the Holy Spirit. The window was unveiled on Sunday, the 19th March, 1922, by Mr. Thomas Scott of Dundela Park, the mother of Margaret. It was dedicated by the Reverend Charles Thornton Primrose Grierson, who was Bishop of Down, Connor and Dromore. The Reverend Alexander Moore, who had served as a chaplain in the Great War, was rector of St. Donard's at that time. The theme of the three-light window is resurrection of Christ. The tracery, as I've said, features the dove of the Spirit and the Alpha and Omega. Margaret Armstrong Scott was born on 3rd October 1884 at the Park in Gorey, County Wexford, to Thomas Scott and Catherine Darby. In 1901, the family was living on the Upper Newtonards Road, and Thomas was recorded as being a provisions merchant. In 1911, the family was living at Dundella Drive. Thomas was now recorded as being a horticultural instructor, and Margaret was recorded as being a designer. On 10th September 1912, Miss Margaret Armstrong Scott departed from Liverpool on SS Coronia bound for New York, where she married George Alexander Anderson on 18th September of the same year. Margaret and George Anderson lived at the Carnegie Buildings in Pittsburgh. Margaret Armstrong Scott, now Anderson, was 30 years old when she died, and she is buried in Common Grave C in the Old Church Cemetery in Queenstown, which is, as I said before, is now Cove in County Cork. I've often wondered when I look at this picture as to what it is she's holding in her left hand. Is it a photograph of her intended husband, or is it something else? I suppose we'll never know. But again, it's a very posed photograph, obviously, as they did in those days, where the chair is being used as a prop. I'm going to finish off by talking about one of the survivors, and that's Henry Stanley, who was known as Harry. He was born on 10th April 1892 at Florenceville in the Ballinafi area to Robert Oliver Stanley, a salesman, and Madeline Cumming, a teacher. And the family lived at Hillview on Knockbreeder Road. Henry Stanley was an engine room fireman on RMS Lusitania during her fateful voyage, and he survived the tragedy. Now, when a ship gets torpedoed, generally the first people to die are the men who are working in the engine rooms, because they are below the waterline or close to the waterline. So Henry Stanley must have been incredibly fortunate to have survived. Two of his brothers served in the army during the Great War. Lieutenant Robert Oliver Stanley, 12th Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, was killed in action on 9th April 1916, aged 26, in Mesopotamia, and he's commemorated on the Basra Memorial in what is now called Iraq. Corporal John Cumming Stanley, 8th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles, survived the war, being transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on 22nd March 1919. So you've got a situation where the family in May 1915 would have been overjoyed that one of their sons had survived the sinking of RMS Lusitania, and then within a year they lose one of their other sons to war. Probably also quite delighted that a third son survived the war. Henry Stanley is commemorated, or is remembered, on the Roll of Honour for Great Victoria Street Presbyterian Church. So in all, we've got 3 members of the Lusitania, 2 of whom died, 1 survived, but they're all commemorated in one shape or another in Presbyterian church congregations in Belfast and Ballylesson. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings the formal part of this talk to an end.